Though he could not see their faces, he could see their postures, which betrayed their confusion. He tried a different word.
What is going on, you guys? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Trey, and today, guys, we're going to be reacting to another Star Wars vs. Warhammer special. This is number 1313. Now, I'm excited to see what's going to happen. I'll ask some of you guys, is the Republic going to pull this victory out of the hat, or is the Imperium just going to continue to lay the smackdown? I don't know. Let's see what a fan with too much time has got in store for us today, you guys. But without further ado, let's get into this. Video starting in 3, 2, 1, go! Lucky number 13. What's he running
felt
after?
Dragged out, his breath rushing, wheezing in and out of his mask. The air was becoming moist and frigid, and through the scream and boom of weapons fire, the sound of approaching rain marching across the metal of Azure City could be heard. His flesh was terrified, and his limbs shook hard with both exhaustion and more. Above him, the black clouds roiled and flashed, but it was not just lightning which wove in and out from between them, the aerial battle over the ground forces having moved almost directly over the park. His mind was horrified, filling and then overflowing with emotions, sensations, and thoughts. Before him were the barricades of the enemy and the inescapable honor of his duty as a corpsman. Above all of that, the spinning and often burning forms of Imperial and Republic aircraft, which fell in balls of hateful flame, descended in wide variants around the multitude of spires below them, crashing and exploding like man-made meteors. The smell of caustic fuel and singed metal was so thick it almost seemed to impede his forward movement, only helping the fear which chewed at his body and devoured his mind drill ever deeper. And yet, in spite of this, 1313 was in the throes of elation. His spirit soared such that he barely felt the pain in his bruised legs or the weight of his gear as his aching, booted feet pounded down on the broad, pale metal avenue of the alien hive city. Bolts flew past him, coming so close as to sear the processed and oiled leather which composed most of his mask. He didn't even try to dodge anymore. 1313 was part of the 5th rank, first row. He had been forced into the former, but had been granted the latter at his silent request. Though a scant few of the 4th rank had managed to reach the barricades, the true task fell to him and his. He would either die gloriously, drawing fire away from others, or he would kill gloriously by vaulting the first barricade and falling upon the foe with zeal. The Krieger had wisely chosen a section of the barricade that was not glowing, but knew that he would not be the only one to select it. He had no intention of getting jammed at the choke point, and to avoid that there was only one thing he knew he could do. Be the first one there, the first one over.
Now, guys, is this going back to the last episode where they're on the bridges and Clone Trooper 95 is about to blow the bridges? Is lucky number 1313 on the Imperial side and he's trying to jump over the barricades? What's going on so far, guys? Let's see.
Naturally, that meant he had to run faster, and equally naturally, that prevented him from dodging or otherwise impeding himself. He could only speed up, never slow down, not when he was so close, so very close. And, as naturally as everything else mentioned thus far, 1313 knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that all his brothers around him would have come to the exact same conclusion. He was aided in his attempt by the fact that he was the fastest man in his platoon, despite being a fresh recruit from the death world of his decanting. He was impaired by the equally true fact that he had nearly broken his legs falling to rescue the Major earlier that day. But the combination of both was what ensured his success. Had he been faster, as several of his brothers were, he would have been targeted en masse by the focused fire of the gleaming white soldiers who huddled behind their emplacements. But Had he been slower, his hand would not have been the first to land on the lip of the barricade. The clone standing there had fired a volley at another Krieger who had been just in front of 1313 and had not been fast enough to catch the second guardsman after killing the first. The corpsman did not scream or cry out, focusing all of those things into his body and purpose as he vaulted the barrier, one hand holding his lass as he braced the butt of the weapon in the crook of his arm, while the other hand landed and pushed against the wide lip of the barrier in question. He didn't make any noise more overt than a grunt as he planted a hard kick into the clone trooper's chest, knocking the Republic soldier back and creating space for himself to land. The clones beside him swung to face him and fired. The first shot flew wide as the head of the clone who shot it blackened, the soldier screaming as his flesh and brain cooked in a spray of last shots that came from beyond the barricade. The other shot was much more precise, but 1313 managed to duck it by charging forward, bracing his las gun in both hands and aiming the bayonet towards the enemy as he did. The clone he had kicked was recovering swiftly from his stagger, but his DC-15A blaster rifle was heavy and had a very long barrel. He swung the blaster down to fire it and did, but the end of the barrel cracked against 1313's hard helmet, firing behind the Krieger as he rushed in. The corpsman almost stumbled into the clone as he thrust forward with the bladed end of his weapon, just managing to catch himself before going down. The Republic soldier cried out, white armor splitting and cracking as hardened Mechanicus-forged steel slid into him. They both hit the back of the second.
All right. So this does sound like 1313 is on the bridge that the stormtroopers are about to blow up. This is going to be interesting to see from an opposing point of view. Hopefully he's off the bridge when it blows, but we will see. We'll see what happens, you guys. Let's keep going.
A taller barricade and collapsed in a tangle. The remaining clone turned to fire, hesitating as he stepped back and tried to safely shoot 1313 despite his proximity to the pained, groaning form of his pod brother. That hesitation cost him as another Krieger vaulted over the same spot 1313 had just come in through, knocking the barrel of the clone aside and beginning a grapple. 1313 did not pause or hesitate as he pulled the trigger of his weapon once, twice, and then a third time, satisfied when the clone ceased its screaming. The Imperial pulled back and away from the Republic soldier as the jerking movements of an all-too-familiar human death row took possession of the replique's burnt body. The Krieger turned just in time to watch his own brother, 1315, finishing with his clone combatant. The two had wrestled to the ground, losing their weapons in the struggle. 1315 had seized the clone's helmet, ripping it away before clasping his gloved hands around the Republic slave's neck. In response, the clone at first clawed at 1315's unflinching masked face before clasping his fists together and raising them. He brought them down again and again on the Krieger's face, cracking the lenses of his mask and damaging the respirator tube, but nothing the clone did could make 1315 release his ever-tightening grip. 1313 busied himself with firing over his brother's shoulder into the ranks of the clones lining the barricades, many of whom were already dealing with Kriegsmen in their midst. When 1315 had finished his grisly work, he looked at 1313 through the empty eye holes of his mask, the lenses completely dislodged. Yellow, bloodshot eyes gleamed in that darkness, and with a nod, 1313 knew to move forward and take point. The double-layered barricades meant that, even now, they were still losing Kriegers, but as more and more of them made it to the first layer of barriers, the difference was becoming clear. Moving among these confines, even when under fire, was their speciality, and the clones stood no chance within close range. Some of the Republic's sergeants and other officers appeared to have requisitioned some potent combat knives prior to the battle, but the rank and file had no such armament, and it showed. The Imperials, by contrast, drew entrenching tools, combat knives, and bore their bayoneted rifles as they poured into the close confines behind the barricades.
Just wait until the chainsaw swords come out.
Like acid against the pristine white defenders. The roiling clouds above them released blasts of cold wind and soon rain as well. The approaching and then thickening sheets of freezing water reflected the light of lasfire and blaster bolts as it swept over the embattled positions. Fog rose from the heated bridge, its surface pocked with weapons fire, and from the fighting soldiers of either side, the mouths of their weapons hissing and sizzling, mixing steam and smoke into a gray miasma which stalked the battle like a specter. The repeating blaster cannons began to fire into their own first barricade more and more as the death corps of Krieg cut into and through several positions along the first line. 1313 heard the cavalry horns blow again, but knew that he and his had been the last of the charging infantry ranks. In other words, Major Lazarus's plan depended entirely on what they could do, here, now, using only what had managed to survive the butchery on the bridge. 1313 and 1315 were facing down a massing group of clones who had managed to repel the Kriegers gunning for their positions. Having successfully weathered the death charge into their defensive line, and having many, many more forces within the barricades than beyond them, the clones turned their full attention to their flanks. One line of clones lay straight down on the ground, another line kneeled over them, and the last line stood over the second, all of them bearing their long rifles and creating overlapping ranks of blue fire, which they sent into the Kriegers at either side of them. 1313 and his brother hit the ground hard, ducking the shots and aping the clones as they lay on their bellies, barely avoiding the first volley as they returned fire with their own. 2 clones dropped, but many, many more shot back. 1313 could smell the acrid stench of his and his brother's greatcoats catching fire as several shots found the prone Imperials, burning pain blossoming on his back, left arm, shoulder, and head. His flak armor negated most of the initial damage with the help of the thick, chemically treated coat, and the shot on his head glanced clean off his thick helmet, having struck at an angle. But he had completely lost the use of his left arm, the limb having suffered several strikes and becoming entirely unresponsive.
So guys, do we think 1313 is going to survive? I have a sinking feeling that he is not going to make it out of this battle in one piece. I think he's going to do something spectacular. I'm not sure what that will be, but I don't think he's going to make it out of this alive. But we'll see.
A still mass of hidden cooked flesh and pain. Almost as fast, 1313
He's just like Vegeta, is always his left arm.
Felt his stim implant activate, filling him with numbing heat which bore down on the pain which now assailed him. Not that it mattered. Without his left arm to steady his las rifle, he could do little more than pull his weapon's trigger, which he had not stopped doing anyway. But even had his arm remained functional, there was no way he and 1315 could kill all the clones before them.
Yeah, I don't see
Luckily,
that happening.
they didn't have to, as the second cadre of Death Riders leapt over the barricades again, but this time aiming their lances down, most catching the helmet or torso of a clone as they passed overhead. 1313 watched as one of the vaunted, fatalistic riders soared over the firing ranks of the enemy. The explosive head of his lance caught the head of one of the standing troopers in the center left of the formation, detonating and killing all the standing clones and several of the others while stunning the rest. 1313 was forced to watch helplessly as 1315 finished off the survivors, still able to effectively wield his own lasgun despite the fire he had also taken. Not only that, but other corpsmen soon joined them, taking over the fighting for long enough for 1313 to rise to his knees and assess his damage. From what he could tell, he would live, which was a shame because he could not tell if his left arm was even still attached to his body under the burnt tatters of his coat's sleeve. He did his best to pad out the scattered flames which feebly licked at his chemically drenched uniform and discarded his lasgun before going to 1315. He was in an even worse way, still laying on the ground, his back and shoulders littered with scorch marks and deep burns. 1313 patted down the flames there and saw right away why his brother had not risen. The corpsman had received damage to his spine in 2 locations, both around his waist. Both would mean he was paralyzed from that point down. 1313 considered drawing his combat knife and ending 1315 swiftly, but his brother's words halted him.
Drop me up and go!
The Krieger rasped from behind his mask.
Are you sure? You're paralyzed.
Said 1313.
I could.
He continued, but was cut off.
An easy death is no death. My arms still work, which means I can still kill. Drop me up and let me earn my death.
Said his brother. 1313 nodded and...
That is some cold-blooded sugar honey iced tea. Some cold-blooded crap right there. He said, you're not going to kill me. You're going to prop me up, and I'm going to take out as many of these guys as I can before they take me out. That 1315, you got my respect, sir.
Hefted 1315 with his good arm, pulling him out of the way as to not be trampled. More and more of their brothers were coming this way, shooting and charging in standard silence. Those who had been issued grenades tossed them over the high walls of the second barricades, buying themselves time to fight the clones here in the first row as other corpsmen sought to breach the second. He set his brother down against the wall of the second barricades, kicking 1315's legs in to help support his awkward sitting posture. The crippled Krieger clutched at his own gun with one hand as he was moved, but handed 1313 something with his other hand when the younger Krieger moved away to examine his work. Held tightly in the corpsman's gloved hand was a silver-plated las pistol with the words Krieg Sind engraved in extravagant lettering on the side of the barrel. At a glance, 1313 could see that it was an overcharged weapon, a hotshot variant of the standard las pistol, the kind of gun a quartermaster would never issue to men of their ranking. 1313 took the gun with his one good hand, flipping it into his grip before looking back at 1315. The Krieger offered no explanation. He merely gestured with a jerk of his head for his brother to get a move on, and with a nod, he did. With the combat stims running through him, 1313 found the dead weight of his flopping limb to be more annoying and hindering than painful, but he did his best to ignore it either way as he chased his fellow brothers up the line, looking for a way over the second barricades. Soon enough, the line of Imperials reached a hole burned into the wall, clearly created by the draconic blasts of a melt-a-gun. The men funneled in and were met immediately with slaughter. The clones had repositioned, using the time bought by their first defensive line to distance themselves and take cover behind the stacked trunks of the trees which had once adorned the park. They moved fluidly and intelligently, retreating without shame and redeploying without mercy. While the Death Corps of Krieg was more than willing to bear the losses of their assault, they simply did not have the numbers to maintain their high attrition. More than half of the clones defending the bridge were still alive and fighting, and the Kriegers who had survived the bridge crossing were barely a handful in comparison. The Death Riders leapt and bounded around and behind the enemy, but their lances were spent and their cadre was few in number compared to the clones they needed to disrupt. So, try as they might, their pressure alone was not enough to break the Republic's finest. 1313 charged through the choke point, trying to place his ruined arm in front of himself, hoping it would provide some kind of protection as he ran. He could not tell if it worked, as the man behind him took a shot in the eye and dropped down forward, bearing 1313 down along with several others. They struggled and kicked before a rain of blaster bolts pelted into the squirming pile of soldiers, making them still. 1313 was trapped nearest at the bottom of the pile, though the dead had already clogged the area so heavily that he was certainly not touching the ground. He pulled his pistol hand free of the corpses pressing in and around him and began to take shots. As he did, other holes were burned and blown into the second barricades, and more corpsmen rushed through, helping to disperse the fire, though some clones did notice him and began shooting back. However, it was difficult for the clones to know which body in that pile belonged to the arm that was shooting at them, and while several clones scored headshots, it was on the dying men who were not attacking. 1313 paid them back with shots of his own. Finally,
go,
one of the
13.
Kriegers managed to get close enough to successfully pitch a grenade into their cover, scattering the clones and buying 1313 the time he needed to struggle free of the pile
Get
around
up
him.
and get a move on.
There were so few of his brothers left that they did not even trample him as he extricated himself, though perhaps this was due instead to how clogged his choke point had become, with men piled nearly to groin height behind him. 1313 marveled at his terrible luck. How on Krieg's damned surface had he managed to survive this long?
It's a
It didn't
great
matter,
question.
he told himself, as he could plainly see that the clones were starting to push them back, something which only happened just before defeat became inevitable. After all, Kriegers did not retreat, not ever. He saw the clones that had been driven away returning to their positions, some sending wide shots at him, which he ducked, running towards them instead of seeking cover among the fallen around him. The corpsman opened fire, his bad arm flopping back and forth, his combat stim starting to wear thin as the rain continued to pelt his uniform and mask. He couldn't tell how effective his shooting was through the mist and rain, but he hoped to kill some of them before they honed in on him. Time seemed to slow as he watched the long spines of their Xenos weapons barrels protrude from over the logs and branches of the fallen trees. He watched as one fired, and then another, and another. He tried to duck, but his feet felt uncoordinated, his adrenaline also beginning to fade now, leaving him devoid of much of his strength. Pain was flooding him from where it had before been staunched, but it was not doing it fast enough to prevent him from trying to complete his charge. Shots sailed over and around him, singeing his cheek and good elbow as the other barrels found him and prepared to open fire. And then he watched as the barrels withdrew or fell away. From the leftmost flank of the clones, a roar came, a defiant cry that the Krieger had not expected to hear in this battle.
Cadian stands!
The war cry was accompanied by the
Cadian.
flashing of weapons fire as soldiers wearing Cadian green and tan laid into the clones from their exposed flank. The Imperial soldiers had lined up their shots well in advance of the...
Now, guys, I was gonna say there for a second. I from the get-go, I thought the Imperium was just gonna lay a pop, pop, pop smackdown on the Republic, but the Republic is holding its own. Like, I know a fan with too much time has had to kind of, level the playing field out a little bit, but man, with the strategy, their planning, everything they're doing is really throwing the Imperium for a loop. They're still fighting back. They're still winning in some circumstances, but it seems like they are, I don't want to say fighting a losing battle, but they are losing a lot of men. Now, thankfully, they got some of the Cadian guardsmen to come back them up here, but guys, I don't know. The Imperium is just not having a good time with this. Let's see if they can maybe pull a rabbit out of the hat. I don't know.
war cry, and though the clones reacted with admirable speed, it was far from enough as grenades were launched, las shots fired, and autoguns unloaded. The Republic's men were cut down in a few scant heartbeats, and when 1313 managed to stumble around the logs, he found himself aiming at corpses and allies and dropped the muzzle of his gun to point down. Without speaking, the Krieger's eyes followed the path from whence the soldiers had come, seeing other small squads flanking and ambushing the Republic's positions, though the clones were already reacting en masse to the new threat. 1313's sight led him to the skeletal ruin of the second bridge, and there his hidden eyes widened as he saw what was left of the Cadian assault crossing over the exposed beams and struts of the unguarded, if devastated, avenue. Rifles and weapons held up over their heads, or borne on their backs, the Cadians tiptoed in tenuous lines, walking like ants as they balanced and marched over the narrow crossings afforded to them. Some clones began to fire in their direction, but the only ones exposed now were the tail end of the survivors, and those who had made the journey already quickly honed in on the offending clones, providing cover for their kinsmen. 1313 felt elation and pain flood into him in near equal portions, and he staggered, almost dropping his weapon as he caught himself on the wooden barricades the clones had hastily constructed. Bit Bit by bit, the pain in his body was winning out, filling him up and driving out even the chance to feel or think anything else. The Krieger suddenly felt a swelling nausea fill him near to bursting, and dropped the pistol, his one good hand working at the seals of his mask. He managed to yank the whole thing off his face mere seconds before he threw up his morning starch rations and protein, groaning as his legs threatened to collapse beneath him. The cold rain fell on his face, washing away his sweat and the sick that had spilled over his chin and lips. He felt someone tugging at him roughly, jarring him as he was forced down onto the logs, made to sit as many hands grabbed him from several places. He tried to resist, his vision blurry and filling with red, but his one good arm had been restrained, and he had not the strength in his legs to kick very hard. Something sharp jammed into his neck, at the base of his shoulder, and once more the pain receded, though the warmth of his standard combat stims did not return. Instead, a cold, icy sensation spread from the spot, making him shiver, but bringing his dazed mind a sharp, killing focus. He relaxed, recognizing that the many arms which held him were the myriad mechadendrites of a red-robed tech priest who, even now, was fussing and cutting at the greatcoat sleeve around his ruined arm. As the spider-like form of the machine god's chosen tugged and worked on him like a frenzied mechanic, an armored Cadian approached, addressing the tech priest as she continued her work.
Any advice, Magos? We caught them off guard, but they are adapting pretty quick, and they still outnumber our surviving forces, but...
The man started to say,
By a factor of 3.26, enemy has displayed tendencies towards unified adaptation and organization. Maximum deployable force is currently projected to succeed in only 12.1% of simulated battlefield outcomes. Variables are not sufficiently influential or beneficial to provide an acceptable margin for victory. Processing solution. Processing.
The tech priest said, her voice clearly synthesized, though
she's going to be
thickly
processing
accented in the way
for a
of
while.
the throne world and its red sister. The Cadian shrugged and looked back at his men before looking back at her.
Care to say any of that in God?
He began to say.
Processing.
She replied, cutting him off as she continued her callous fleshcraft on 1313. Steel wires spooled out from several of her mechanical arms as syringes and daubs dripping with bitter chemicals darted towards and away from his trembling skin, finding breaches, burns, and all else in short order. Thanks to the anesthetic she had applied to him, the corpsman could mostly only feel pressure and vague stinging. It was nothing like the pain which had been blaring within him before, and he found it easy to hold still, though he did look away from whatever it was she was doing to him. A small flock of servo skulls spun and hovered around them, at least 12 in total, all seeming to orient around the tech priest herself, like paper lamps circling a cyclone.
Solution deduced. Depriving enemy forces of coordination capacity is the most efficient way to upset current statistics,
she said. One of her
Good point.
long mechanical arms stretched and snapped out, snatching a floating servo skull out of the air like a toad's tongue catching a fly. Her limbs began working on it right away, flipping the squirming skull over and exposing the mechanical components which had been crammed into the vacancies within the human bone. She began to frenzy over the squirming skull in much the same way she was over the Krieger, limbs working with inhuman coordination as casings were unscrewed, components moved and replaced, and new additions applied. As she did both this and her medical work, she continued speaking.
The next objective is to take the arms and interface him with one of the energy cells that the enemy are using to power their repeating weapons. My predictive models estimate a 72.8% chance that those energy cells will suffice for our purpose.
Now, guys, I think 1313 is going to volunteer as tribute for this mission, and he is going to take the servitor heads and attach it to the battery cell. And then he will be a hero for the Imperium. But like I said, I don't think he's going to make it out of this.
The Cadian nodded and waved to his men, signaling that they would be moving out very soon. They closed in as he began to speak.
What will Tenny Harmus do once we plug him in? He asked.
The tech priest seemed to finish her work on the servo skull then, taking it and placing it into the captain's hands, the skull's eye lenses and small grapple claws still moving and clamping the air, but its hovering capabilities having been apparently disabled from whatever alterations had been done to it. Its name, Tenny Harmus, was emblazoned onto a golden plate on its forehead.
He will release a multi-frequency broadcast pulse, and will continue to do so for as long as power is maintained and fed into him. This should bring down their comnet, and thereby impair their organizational and adaptational capacities by 88.8%.
That's a lot.
She said.
Right, then we'll get moving to it.
The captain confirmed, tucking the skull under his arm and drawing his pistol.
Wait,
She added. With one more harsh tug to his wounded arm, she stood away from 1313, her mechadendrites lifting him back up to a standing position. He looked himself over, amber eyes widening on his exposed face. The tech priest had amputated his left arm, an act he somehow hadn't felt in any distinct way. Where before had hung the burnt ruin of his formerly functional limb, now all that remained was little more than a hand span out from his shoulder. The sleeve of his greatcoat sewn shut over the stump, hiding the dressing and the flesh it swaddled. The burns and other injuries he had taken had also been located, treated, and bandaged, his uniform having been torn open in the affected areas and then restitched closed once her
She's
work had been
fast,
completed.
lady.
take him with you. He is a member of the Dead Corps, and has succeeded in fighting his way to the back of the line. If nothing else, he will serve as another body to distract from your own.
She said.
She said, look, this guy did some hard work. Take him with you. You know, he might be helpful, but if anything, just use him as a human shield so that you might survive. This lady is cold.
The captain snapped his eyes from her to the unmasked face of 1313, instantly stunned by what he saw. His jaw tightened, and he strode towards him, bending down to pick up the gun 1313 had dropped earlier, looking at it and the words written on it, and then at the soldier before him.
How old are you, Krieger?
The man said. Though the statement was grammatically a question, it was spoken as an order, and 1313 snapped a salute with his one good arm as he answered. 15 solar years, sir, he said to the Cadian. The man nodded grimly, looking back down at the gun one more time.
Are you well enough to fight and not slow us down?
He asked. 1313 gave a sharp, decisive nod of his head, holding his salute.
Now, guys, I'm going to ask y'all a question. 15 solar years. I'm guessing that doesn't mean he's 15 years old, or if it does mean he's 15 years old, he's been modified in some way, shape, or form to grow and have the strength of an adult male. I don't know. Somebody in the comments, let me know that. Like I said, not fully versed in Warhammer 40K, so there's some stuff I don't know. So if you could help me out, that'd be fantastic. Thank you, guys.
Blinking the crisp, freezing rain out of his eyes. The man before him nodded once more and flipped the gun in his hand so that the barrel was held between his fingers and the handle aimed towards the Krieger.
Then take this and follow me,
he said. 1313 broke his salute, taking the gun
Come
from his
with me,
temporary
if you want
superior
to
and
live.
saluting once more. The captain said no more, turning to his men with a whistle and waving them forward as he pulled out a pair of small binoculars and began scanning for the nearest emplacement. While he did this, the tech priest used her many arms to take 1313's mask, wrapping it back around his face and securing it tightly while simultaneously taking the half-spent hotshot power pack out of his gun and replacing it with a fresh one. She spoke not at all as she did this, the many red lenses of her eyes making it unclear if the tech priest was even looking at the corpsman as she finished and turned away. Beginning to move towards another wounded soldier, a Cadian who had taken a shot to the gut and was huffing and cursing behind the others. 1313 hesitated for a moment, but spoke.
Thank you.
The Krieger said to her, not yelling through the rain, but voicing the words nonetheless. She slowed ever so briefly, one of her arms performing a reverse salute in his direction, though she did not turn and did not stop. It was more than he had expected, and he added nothing to it as he turned to wait for the captain's orders. He did not have to wait for very long. The captain was just a little taller than he himself was, with dark skin and pale purple eyes. He kept his hair close to the skull, something which was apparent as the man did not wear a helmet. On the back of his head was tattooed the double-headed eagle of the Imperial Aquila, barely visible against his black skin and the fuzz of his equally black hair.
All right, I've got our target. Stay close and keep your heads down. We are going to follow this line of stacked trees until we are right behind that position over there,
he said, indicating towards their target with an outstretched finger.
Once there, we're going to rush them. Stow the grenades. We can't use explosives or we'll risk damaging the energy cells. Same goes for flamers. Stow them,
the captain ordered. 3 of his squad groaned, slinging 2 grenade launchers and 1 flamer, and drawing combat knives and sidearms.
All right, stay low, stay light, and stay on my trail. Let's go,
he said, and took off, crouching as he went. The squad followed after, the mist and the rain as well as the stacked logs helping to conceal them as they moved up on the first group of clones, who were, themselves, hiding behind wooden barriers, watching to make sure no one snuck up behind the emplacement. But whereas their white and yellow armor practically made them glow among the contrast of the darker trees, the tan and green uniforms of the Cadians and the dark coat of the Krieger with them allowed them to remain inconspicuous as they maneuvered. The squad swung out wide, coming in behind the clones and destroying them in short order. Now in position to charge the emplacement from behind, they had a better idea of what they would be charging into. The firing emplacements were half-domed shells with enough open space in front to allow their repeating blaster free range of targeting. The rear was mostly open and vulnerable, but provided just enough cover to hide behind. The clones inside would be able to hold the position, potentially for long enough for others of their kind to take notice. "We got good cover from here," said a corporal. The woman in question was holding a long las rifle, one of the long-shot variety, and was using the scope on the weapon to scout out the entrance. The captain beside her nodded, but said nothing for a moment as he examined the position. While the corporal was on the captain's right, 1313 came up on his left, with all 3 of them kneeling behind the trees as they peered between the branches, the rest of the squad kneeling or squatting in the thickening mud behind them. "We could take them from here, probably lose less men," she went on. Again the captain nodded, but frowned, clearly not a fan of the idea despite its merit.
Maybe. But they may have time to call for help in that case. Or worse, sabotage the cells. If we do this, we need to do this fast, and...
"Hey, Krieger, what are you doing?" the captain said, but 1313 was already up and moving. It was hard for him to move.
He said, "Look, guys, y'all do what y'all want to do. I'm going. 1 arm and all. I'm going over there. I don't care what you say." You go, 1313.
Around without his left arm, it really threw his balance off something terrible, forcing him to lean oddly and walk sideways as he quickly crept up on the position. The firing of the repeater and the falling of the rain were more than enough to block the sound of his approach, and soon he was huddled by the wall, peeking over the edge. They were crammed in there, most of them shooting out through the wide window, moving around the repeater as it swiveled, all of them helping by supporting their men in the first barricade. 1313 wasn't much for planning.
but he knew he had to at least chance lasting long enough for his distraction to do more than draw attention to the entrance the captain and the Cadians would be using after him. Seeing one clone pull away to reload his long rifle, he moved in, sliding and running right up to the soldier. The clone looked up and was stunned by the sudden appearance of an enemy less than 3 steps from him and snapped his rifle up to fire, but had time for only one shot before 1313 was inside the reach of his long barrel. The shot struck the thick plates on 1313's right shoulder, shattering them, but failing to stop the Krieger as 1313 sent a shot through the clone's right leg. The man cried out in his alien language, and the other clones halted and snapped around, quickly becoming aware of the intruder. The corpsman moved with as much speed as he could, looping around behind the clone he had wounded, pulling them both against the wall near the window and jamming his gun up under the clone's helmet. The Republic soldier collapsed against him, and he fell as well, his only benefits being that the trooper's armored body covered most of his own, and that his lasgun was still firmly pressed against the man's chin. The clones hesitated and then didn't shoot. 1313 blinked. He was sure they would both be blasted to pieces after the clones realized he had dared to take a hostage. One of them yelled at the Krieger, but of course 1313 had not been taught how to speak almost any of their language and had not been equipped with an auto-trans. He had learned a few words, however, to aid in his duties on the planet prior to the counter-invasion. He had not used them once since arriving, but was glad he could use them now.
Bathroom.
1313 said in Galactic Basic, his accent thick, nearly incomprehensible. Though he could not see their faces, he could see their postures, which betrayed their confusion. He tried a different word.
Credits.
He said. The confusion continued in all but one of them, who went rigid for a moment and then spun around, yelling something in his Xenos tongue that was probably analogous to, "He's distracting us." The clone snapped around and fired his rifle, catching one of the Cadians in the chest and throwing him back. The Imperial who came in behind the first opened fire with a shotgun, blowing 2 of the clones away, the one who had fired and the one beside him, before the other Imperials stormed in. The clones turned to meet the attack, but the distraction coupled with how terribly unwieldy their larger guns were in close quarters left them nearly helpless as the Cadians tore into the clone troopers with mid and close-range weaponry. 1313 pulled the trigger of his gun, mercilessly killing the clone he had captured and rolling the dead weight off of his body before rising. The captain approached, executing 2 more wounded clones as he did, face flushed, eyes blazing.
You're lucky that little maneuver didn't kill you, crazy death-worshipping plank.
He slapped 1313's helmet and then turned, pointing at his Cadians.
Jackna, patch up Ithric. Gregor, ready flares.
The captain ordered, walking to the large, square power cell which fed the repeater. The Imperial officer licked his lips, nervous about even touching machines of any kind, but he ultimately determined Xenos technology deserved less reverence than something born of the machine god's will, and pulled the cable feeding the blaster free. He then carefully set the skull down on top of the crate-shaped power cell. The little grappler claws protruding from the bottom of the servo skull clanked and wiggled, pulling it up and enabling it to shamble closer to the now vacant output port. 1313 watched as a single mechadendrite slid out of the base of the skull and fumbled about around the port until it succeeded in blindly feeling it out. It inserted itself, and the whole skull went rigid. The thing then spun, holding itself upside down as another protrusion emerged from beneath and behind its grinning teeth. A long rod, which unfolded to nearly 2 hand spans high before bending near the end and unfurling a radar-like dish. While that went on, Gregor, a large Cadian man with a grenade launcher slung over his shoulder, withdrew a flare gun and some green flares. With a nod from the captain, he sent the shining beacons flying over their heads, stepping out from under the half-dome to get the shots off. They blazed like green suns in the darkness and rain, calling more Cadians to their position. Nothing more seemed to happen then, at least to the men within the emplacement. But all across the scattered battles still going on, a shift was starting to occur, beginning with a nasty surprise to all clones with active comms, which was to say, all of them.
All of them.
A piercing screech soon filled their earpieces, disrupting fire, causing hesitation, and forcing some clones to toss off their own helmets. The distraction was a boon to Imperials all across the barricades, but more than that was what came after, subtle though it was. Republic forces began to lose their cohesion as communications died abruptly. Individual squads were forced to rely on themselves, when before they had been part of a greater whole. The clones were no strangers to independent thinking, but the sudden switch sent them stumbling, and soon many squads had chosen to tactically retreat and regroup, failing to realize what this would mean for the clones that chose to stay and hold their ground. The result was bloody chaos. Some of the Republic clones tried to take back the emplacement, perhaps having even deduced that the source of the comm jamming was coming from there, but 1313 and the Cadians repelled them each time, and as more minutes passed, more and more forces gathered at their position. Finally, most of the clones seemed to settle on a retreat and regroup strategy, and save for the far sides of the bridge, abandoned their barricades, sabotaging the weapons they left behind as they did. This lull in the fighting afforded the scant survivors of the Imperium time to gather and prepare for the counter-assault the clones would inevitably throw back against them. The majority of the Death Corps and Cadian shock troops quickly gathered around the comm jammer following the flares. The remaining tech priests roamed and roved around the emplacement site like busy insects, using monomolecular blades and plasma torches to cut away chunks of the barricades, ferrying them from the first line and re-cementing them in new defensive positions meant to repel invaders from the opposite direction. Heavy weapons were recovered from the dead, while the wounded were gathered and placed within cover for medics and tech priests to examine and tend. 1313 found himself sitting on a log within the new ring of rapidly forming defenses, his silvered pistol holstered, a protein bar clutched tightly in his one hand. Around him sat the Cadians. He had sought to rejoin the others of his corps, but the soldiers in green had been insistent, and 1313 had found himself too withdrawn and far too exhausted to deny them. They sat in a rough circle around a plasma burner, which provided them with just enough warmth to negate the utter cold of the still falling rain. Above them, the battle in the sky raged on, moving closer, and then farther, and then closer again, fire and lightning descending from the sky with near equal regularity. A Republic gunship fell, spinning from above, firing wildly before crashing 40 meters away from where they sat. The crash made most of them flinch, but no one moved or reacted outside of that.
So, Krieger, what the hell got into you back there?
Asked one of the Cadians, a woman named Jackna. She wore the red spiral of the Medicae, but seemed little different from the rest in all other respects. Her eyes were a light violet, and her short hair was a burnished orange which stuck out from under her helmet in random, matted tufts. She had her own protein bar, holding the rectangular ration pack with one hand as she pulled the long plastic pin attached to it with the other. Once the pin was pulled free, the packet inflated to the point that it looked like it might burst before a little hole popped open on the end of the bar, ejecting a line of steam which whistled for a moment before petering out. She then peeled the pack open, revealing the gray, puffy substance of the ration, consuming it eagerly. 1313 simply shrugged in response, face still hidden behind his mask.
I don't like the sound of those protein bars. They don't sound very good.
Oh, come on, you really going to be humble? You charged into a nest of enemy soldiers with so much confidence they didn't even know you didn't belong there before you got a hold of one of them, said another man, Julian. This man was enormous, far larger than everyone barring Gregor, who was just smaller. His head and face were clean-shaven, revealing a motley of scars and burns, as well as his cybernetic eye. The man was on his third ration bar. 1313 nodded but added nothing else, making the man's face fall flat. How about we get his name before we try prying into how he thinks? Asked another woman in the group, a round-faced Cadian with long black hair. She cradled a long-shot lass, even as she ate, though she had loosened her flak armor for comfort and tossed off her helmet, allowing the rain to fall directly onto her. Her name was Emiliana, ranked corporal. So, what's your name? I'm sure they give you a name in the Corps. She asked, polishing off the rest of her own ration bar. 1313 nodded, but did not say anything else right away. A harsh laugh followed that, coming from Gregor, who sat opposite the Krieger. The man was thicker than he was tall, and it was all muscle. His brown hair was cut short, completely shaved on the sides and flat on the top. He smiled an unpleasant, unamused smile. Don't bother with him, Emiliana. Kriegers don't like to talk or fraternize with non-Kriegers. They think we're lacking in faith or conviction, because we don't die as often as they do. He said with a sneer. Emiliana frowned at that, looking first at Gregor and then at 1313. Is that true? Do you really believe that? She asked him. He paused before answering, as if considering the question. This was probably the longest he had ever spent interacting with people who were not from his homeworld, and, honestly, it was also one of the chattiest interactions he had ever been party to. But being chatty didn't make one unfaithful, or speak to their conviction. And, obviously, it only made sense that there would be faithful beyond the boundaries of Krieg. After all, Krieg had sinned, and they had not. But more than anything else, he reflected on what he had seen and experienced in their company. No, he said, adding no more. Jackna smiled and raised her eyebrows, and Horsten, one of the men wielding a flamer, chuckled into his hands as he crouched over his bar, eating silently as the conversation went on around him. Well, see that? Emiliana said brightly. We must not be so bad. Gregor rolled his eyes, but did not contradict her, and went back to his food. 1313 looked back down at his bar, and then heard the woman next to him chuckle. Looking over, he almost leaned back and away as Emiliana leaned in towards him, coming close as she reached for the ration bar in his hand. Here, let me, she said, taking the plastic pin and yanking it for him. The packet heated and inflated in his hand, but she did not pull away. Still so very close to him, so close he could almost smell her through the rain and rebreathe her. Balancing her rifle in her lap, she reached her arms around his head and undid the lowest of the buckles which secured his mask. 1313 sat like a statue, feeling an odd, human sensation flush through him. His stomach tightened, his face felt hot, but he did not move an inch, trained to hold fast in the face of anything resembling fear. She pulled up on his mask, and he almost dropped his heating protein bar to stop her, but she seemed to notice and shushed him, only pushing the mask up far enough for his mouth to be exposed. There, she said, drawing away, taking her rifle back into her hands. He gave her a hesitant nod, almost flinching when the packet in his hands popped and began venting steam, his head snapping round to eye it. Jackna grinned and Julian laughed, while Gregor spat to the side like he had just tasted something bad.
Careful, Corporal,
said Julian.
Kriegers ain't trained to handle that kind of battle.
Upon hearing that, 1313 felt a true blush color his face for the first time in years, and he brought the bar up to his mouth, tearing the packaging away with his teeth and spitting it before starting to eat. Emiliana smiled wickedly at her comrade and shrugged. I have no idea whatsoever what you could possibly mean. Look sharp, said the squad sergeant. He had been away at a meeting with other members of the command staff, and now came back into the circle unexpectedly, geared and standing as if ready for battle. No one needed to hear or see any more to get ready, tightening armor, checking weapons, and standing all at once. They coming back already? Asked Gregor. Yeah, and with a hell of a lot of friends, said the sergeant, a squat, thickly built man named Vetnex, though called Vet for short. Vet tossed Gregor a pair of binoculars, and the big man wasted no time in coming to stand on the logs to look over the new barricades and trenches which had been built. The sight made him spit and curse.
Emperor's fecking teeth!
He said, coming down and handing Emiliana the binoculars. 1313 went to stand beside her, and though she still used the binoculars, she barely needed them at all. Nearly 2/4 of the defending force had survived the retreat, and what was coming back was well over 3 times that number. So massive a force that they were plainly visible as an indistinct horde of white, even through the distant rain and flashing of lightning.
They screwed.
"What's the plan, Sergeant?" asked Emiliana, eyes transfixed as she watched.
There is no way for us to kill that many replicae, even dug in. They outnumber us 10 to 1,
said Jackna.
"We're pulling back across the bridge. There's no point in just dying here,"
said Gregor.
"Aw, come on. We can hold them until more guys arrive,"
said Julian, punching Gregor's shoulder.
"All of you, quiet down," snapped the sergeant. "We have been conferring with the Death Corps, and they have let us in on the larger strategy.
Major Lazarus is leading the rest of his forces through the connecting passageways that the clones have been using to retreat. He plans to come up behind their lines, kill their crews, and destroy their artillery. But for that to work,
he needs an Emperor damn distraction,"
concluded Gregor. The sergeant
Most
nodded.
definitely.
It ain't a glamorous job, but it's our job. Once we see his signal, we can begin retreating back across the bridge. But until that happens, we have to not only hold, but fight hard enough that all they can see is us. You lot got that?" The Cadians snapped to salute at the words.
"Sir, yes, sir,"
they said together. "All right, then get ready. 5 minutes. Take care of what you can, then meet right here to find out where you are going. Eat if you can, shit if you can't, but don't be late. Go get on with it," said Vet before going back the way he had come.
Shit if you can.
1313 watched on, and when the speaking was done, turned back to see the sluggish tide of white moving towards them. He wondered briefly if they were taking their time because they were confident in victory, or because their comms being down truly slowed them by that much. He didn't break his gaze as Emiliana began to speak from beside him. "How many of them do you think are out there?" she asked. He shrugged his shoulders, but then, after a moment, added something.
1,313,
he said. "Huh?" she asked, turning to look at him.
"My name
He clarified.
is 1,313.
She nodded slowly, but smiled after a moment. "All right, 13. Until this battle is done, you are part of my squad. Do you have a problem with that?" she asked. He didn't respond right away, looking at the other men of the Death Corps, most of whom were digging or expanding the trenches, something he could not exactly aid in with his one arm. His brothers would tolerate him, but he was a cripple, and they would treat him as such. Perhaps it was an echo of his human origin, preserved even through the Vitae womb which birthed him. Perhaps it was merely his tired, drugged mind choosing the path of least resistance. Perhaps it was just the weakness of a 15-year-old boy. But 13 did not deny her. He merely shrugged. She slapped his right shoulder, beaming as he flinched from the blow. The blaster burned there, sending a jolt of agony through him. "All right, then load up and eat what you can while you can. I'll let the others know you are sticking around for the fight." He looked at her and nodded, watching as she left to tell the others about his inclusion. 13 didn't know how he felt about the decision he had just made. But as his eyes moved back
You
to
made
the
the
mass
decision
of
now, sir.
white-clad soldiers coming over the barren hills, he began to doubt that it would matter. Dying among the Corps, or dying among the Cadians, it made little difference. Death would be inevitable. Death was his destiny. Unless, of course, the God Emperor chose otherwise.
No, come on. It was just getting good. Wow, guys, what a freaking episode. Lucky number 1313. So that definitely played out a little bit differently than I thought it would. I thought that, 13 was ultimately just gonna die, because it seems to be the trend we're following here. But He's one of the only of his squad, his line, to actually survive. He did lose an arm, but he still didn't let that slow him down. Still went back, fought, kicked some ass, took some names. You go 13. But guys, God, the battle for Axum is taking a turn, a definite turn. Like I said, originally I thought the Imperium was just gonna lay the pop smack down on the Republic. They didn't stand a chance. But it seems like the Republic, through their technical tacticians, their skills, their strategies, they are, they're not as strong up front as the Imperium, or so it seems. But they are still fighting hard and still finding a way to undermine the Imperium. Now, like I said before, I know a fan with too much time has had to kind of level the playing field here. But, guys, the Republic is definitely putting a pounding on the Imperium. So, let's see what the next episode has in store for us, guys. But with that being said, guys, that's going to be the end of the episode for tonight. If you have anything other than Star Wars versus Warhammer or Warhammer related that you'd like me to check out, go ahead and drop that down in the comments. I'll be sure to check that out for you guys. But with that being said, guys, that's the end of the video for tonight. But, big major but, for those of you that are even still here at this point in time, we're going to be dropping a community dashboard or something. We're going to be talking about giving away this lightsaber because we have finally crossed 2,000 subs. So, thank you for that, guys. Thank you for all the subscribers. Thank you for sitting back, hanging out with me, watching the cool videos. But, like I said, guys, that's the end of the video for tonight. Peace, love, happiness to you. And always, guys, be easy. Love y'all.